The year was 1944, and the sky above France was a strange shade of silver that morning. It was the kind of sky that made soldiers uneasy, too quiet, too still, as if the clouds were holding their breath. In the small town of Saint-Aube, Corporal Arthur Bennett adjusted the strap of his rifle and scanned the rooftops. His boots were caked with dried mud, the kind that stuck for days, even when you thought you had cleaned it off. Arthur was 24, but war had added a decade to his face. His eyes no longer carried the spark of youth. Instead, they held the cold alertness of a man who had seen too much. Behind him, Private Tom Whitmore shuffled nervously, his helmet tilted too far forward. "Stay close, Tom," Arthur muttered without turning. "I'm close," Tom replied. "Too close. I can see the sweat on your neck." Arthur almost smiled. Almost. They were part of the 5th Infantry Division, tasked with securing Saint-Aube, a sleepy farming town that had the misfortune of being caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied troops. The streets were eerily empty. Doors hung ajar, curtains fluttered in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once before falling silent. The squad moved forward cautiously. Sergeant George Ellison, their leader, raised his hand to signal a halt. His sharp voice cut through the air. "Two at the church. Rifles ready. Bennett, Whitmore, flank right. Move." Arthur and Tom darted into an alley. The walls were close and damp, smelling faintly of rotten cabbage. A cat bolted past them, its fur bristling. Arthur's grip tightened on his rifle. In this war, even a shadow could kill you. They reached the churchyard wall. Arthur peered around the corner and froze. 2 German soldiers stood guard near the main door, smoking cigarettes. They looked tired, their faces pale under their steel helmets. One of them laughed softly at something the other said. Arthur hated this moment, the pause before deciding whether to kill a man who wasn't yet aiming at you. The rules of war didn't leave much space for hesitation, though. He motioned to Tom, who nodded reluctantly. A sharp crack split the air. The first German fell instantly, cigarette dropping from his lips. The second whirled around, raising his rifle, but Tom fired before he could shoot. The man staggered, dropped his weapon, and collapsed against the church steps. Tom's breathing was ragged. They were just standing there. Arthur didn't answer. In war, there was no just. You did what you had to, or you didn't come back. Inside the church, the air was thick with candle smoke and the faint smell of damp stone. Dust motes drifted lazily in the dim light filtering through the cracked stained glass windows. The pews had been pushed to one side in a haphazard pile, as though someone had tried, and failed, to create a barricade. The only sound was the soft whimper of a baby. A handful of civilians were gathered near the altar. An old woman clutched a rosary so tightly that her knuckles were white. A boy, perhaps 10, stood barefoot with his clothes torn and streaked with dirt. A young woman sat on the floor, cradling a baby wrapped in a worn blanket. The child's eyes were wide but eerily quiet, as though it had already learned that silence was the safest choice in wartime. The woman looked up at Corporal Arthur Bennett as he approached. Her face was pale, streaked with grime, and her lips trembled as she spoke. Words tumbled out in rapid French, so fast they overlapped. Arthur caught fragments. Soldats sous-sol s'il vous plaît, aide. His French wasn't perfect, but it was enough to catch her meaning. Soldiers' basement, please help. Sergeant George Ellison came striding up the aisle, his boots ringing sharply on the stone floor. His expression was hard, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes as he glanced at the civilians. "What's she saying, Bennett?" he asked. Arthur straightened slightly. "She says there are Germans in the basement, sir. 5 or 6 of them. Possibly armed with a machine gun." Ellison muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse.
"Right.
Bennett, Whitmore, Hargrave, with me. Rest of you, secure the area. Keep these people safe." Corporal William Bill Hargrave, their demolitions man, was already moving before the order was finished. Stocky and broad-shouldered, Hargrave carried his explosives kit like it weighed nothing. He gave Arthur a quick nod. "Basement door, then?" They found it at the back of the church, half hidden behind a sagging curtain. The wooden door was bolted from the inside, the old hinges dark with rust. Hargrave pressed his ear against the wood for a moment, then pulled back and shook his head. "No chance of forcing it quietly," he murmured. "Best use a charge." Arthur and Private Tom Whitmore stepped back as Hargrave knelt to work. He pulled a small block of explosive from his satchel, fixed it near the lock, and ran a short length of fuse. "Low yield," he explained quietly. "We don't want to bring the whole bloody church down." Ellison gave the nod, and Hargrave lit the fuse. The explosion was muffled but sharp, filling the corridor with a puff of smoke and splinters. The door sagged on its ruined hinges, and Ellison kicked it open. They rushed in, rifles raised. The basement was a low-ceilinged, dimly lit space, the single bulb overhead swaying slightly from the concussion of the blast. The air was damp and smelled faintly of mold. Shadows shifted in the far corner as German voices barked hurried orders. A sudden burst of gunfire ripped through the gloom, the bullets snapping against the stone wall and sending chips flying. Arthur threw himself behind a stack of wooden crates, the rough edges biting into his cheek as he landed. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat loud in his ears. Whitmore slid in beside him, fumbling to reload, his face pale but determined. From across the room, Hargrave fired a short, controlled burst. Ellison's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Covering fire. Move up, Bennett." Arthur took a breath, then darted from cover to a half-collapsed pillar. The Germans were clustered near a table where ammunition belts lay coiled like snakes. A machine gun sat on its tripod, but it was unmanned. The loader lay sprawled on the ground, unmoving. Another burst of fire erupted, this time wild and desperate. Arthur raised his Lee Enfield, sighted on a helmeted figure, and squeezed the trigger. The man crumpled instantly. The fight was over in less than 2 minutes, though it felt far longer. 3 Germans lay still on the damp floor. 2 more dropped their weapons and raised their hands high, their eyes wide and darting. Sweat gleamed on their foreheads, and one of them kept glancing at the civilians' direction upstairs, as though fearing retribution. Ellison strode forward, rifle steady. "Search them," he ordered. Hargrave and Whitmore moved in, patting down pockets and removing sidearms. The prisoners were tied with lengths of rope scavenged from a crate in the corner. Arthur kept his rifle trained on them until Ellison gave the signal to stand down. His hands ached from gripping the weapons so tightly, but he didn't loosen his hold. Even in surrender, men could be dangerous. The flickering bulb above them buzzed softly, casting uneven light over the scene. In that strange half-light, Arthur felt the sharp edge of reality press in. This wasn't the clean, heroic war from the recruiting posters back home. There were no triumphant speeches or easy victories, only short, brutal bursts of violence followed by a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire. As they led the prisoners upstairs, Arthur glanced once more at the basement. The damp walls, the scattered shell casings, the smell of cordite, they would stay with him, long after the war moved on to the next street, the next town, the next fight. In the end, there was no victory here. There was only survival. That night, they made camp on the outskirts of St. Aube. The fighting had stopped hours ago, but the silence felt heavier than the gunfire. A cold rain began to fall just after dusk, the kind that seeped through uniforms and found its way into your bones. The dirt beneath their boots quickly turned to thick, clinging muck, making every movement an effort. Corporal Arthur Bennett found a half-collapsed barn and claimed a patch of dry ground beneath what remained of the roof. The timbers above groaned in the wind, and water dripped steadily from the broken beams. He settled down cross-legged, methodically stripping and cleaning his Lee Enfield rifle. The familiar ritual was oddly comforting, a series of practiced motions that gave his mind something steady to hold on to after the chaos of the day. Across from him, Private Tom Whitmore sat hunched on an overturned crate, elbows on his knees, staring into the churned mud, as though it might offer answers. The rain plastered his fringe to his forehead, but he didn't bother to push it away. He had been quiet since the church basement, speaking only when necessary. They were kids, Arthur. Tom said at last, his voice low but edged with something that wasn't quite anger, more like disbelief. Arthur glanced up briefly, then returned his attention to the rifle bolt in his hands. "We're all kids here, lad." Tom shook his head.
"No.
"I mean younger than me. 17, maybe 16. Couldn't have been more than that." His voice wavered. One of them was shaking. Not from the cold, from fear. I could see it in his eyes. Arthur slid the bolt back into place with a quiet click. "If you start thinking about it too much, you won't pull the trigger when you need to. And if you don't pull the trigger—" Tom finished for him, the words falling like stones. "You don't come home." The barn creaked again in the wind. Outside, the rain pattered steadily on the collapsed roof, dripping into dark puddles. Somewhere in the distance, muffled by the weather, came the dull thud of artillery, not close enough to be immediate danger, but close enough to remind them the war was moving, creeping toward the next town, the next fight. Tom looked toward the sound. "It never stops, does it?" Arthur didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The war would stop only when it was finished swallowing towns like St. Aube, and not a moment sooner. He leaned back against the barn wall and closed his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he pictured home, his mother's small kitchen with its low-beamed ceiling, the clink of teacups on the table, the smell of bread baking in the oven. He could almost hear the soft patter of rain on the porch roof, the kind that meant you could sit inside and be warm, knowing the world outside couldn't touch you. It felt like another life. Maybe it was. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rain, the wind, and the occasional distant rumble of guns. Tom fished in his pocket and pulled out a small tin of tobacco, offering it across the space between them. Arthur took it, packing the pipe with slow, deliberate movements. The flare of a match briefly lit their faces. Two young men in damp uniforms, shadows under their eyes, their expressions older than their years. As Arthur drew on the pipe, the smell of smoke mingled with the scent of wet hay and mud. For a few minutes, it almost felt like they could pretend the war was far away. But the illusion didn't last. The cold found its way in, the wind sighed through the broken timbers, and somewhere down the road, the artillery spoke again. Arthur handed the pipe back to Tom and picked up his rifle once more. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "We'll be moving again before first light."
Tom didn't argue.
He simply nodded, pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, and stared into the rain as though trying to see beyond it. Arthur watched him for a moment, then turned his gaze toward the darkness outside. The war was still out there, waiting. And so were they. 2 days later, new orders arrived: push to the river and take the bridge before the Germans could demolish it. If they failed, the enemy would have a strong natural barrier and precious time to regroup. At first light, the squad set out. The sky was a pale, heavy gray, the kind that promised rain. Mist clung to the ground, coiling around boots and muffling footsteps. The damp air carried the faint scent of smoke drifting from somewhere ahead. When the bridge finally came into view, it seemed to grow out of the mist, a solid stone structure with twin arches, its weathered surface slick with dew. The river beneath surged fast and cold, churning around the support pillars. On the far bank, dark plumes of smoke curled lazily into the morning air. They were within 50 yards when the stillness shattered. A harsh, rattling burst of machine gun fire erupted from the opposite side, the sound cutting through the mist like tearing metal. Bullets cracked past Corporal Arthur Bennett's head, smacking into the stone parapet with sharp, angry thuds. He threw himself behind a low wall, the impact jarring his shoulder. "Pinned down," Sergeant George Ellison bellowed over the gunfire. "We need that gun silenced now." Arthur turned to Private Tom Whitmore, who was crouched beside him, eyes wide. "You still got those grenades?"
Tom nodded, swallowing hard.
"2 left."
"Right."
"Keep low." They slid over the edge of the embankment and began crawling along the riverbank, the damp earth clinging to their sleeves. The mist worked in their favor, curling around them like a cloak, hiding their approach from the gunner above. The machine gun nest was dug in halfway across the bridge, sandbags piled high around it. The weapon chattered again, sending up puffs of dust and stone where the rounds struck. Arthur eased a grenade from his webbing, pulled the pin with a sharp twist, and counted silently. 1, 2, 3. He hurled it over the sandbags. A split second later, the explosion ripped through the morning, shaking the bridge and sending shards of stone and debris into the air. The gun went silent. Go! Go! Ellison's voice roared from behind. The squad surged forward. Boots thudded on wet stone as they charged across. A few scattered shots rang out from the far bank, but the German defense faltered quickly. The bridge was theirs, but victory came at a cost. Corporal William Hargrave lay sprawled near the parapet, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Tom was already at his side, shouting for a medic. Arthur didn't need to look twice to know the truth. Hargrave wasn't getting up again. By nightfall, the river ran quietly again. The mist had lifted, revealing a sky streaked with red and gold from the setting sun. Arthur stood at the bridge's center, looking down at the water. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion. Tom joined him, eyes red. Hargrave was talking about going fishing when the war was over, he said softly. Arthur didn't answer. There were too many when the war is over stories, and too few men left to live them. From somewhere behind them, Ellison called out, "We move at first light. The war's not waiting for us." Arthur took one last look at the river. In the silence, he could almost imagine the world was at peace. Almost.